When Sarah and Jake moved into their new home on a quiet suburban street, they had no idea they were stepping into the crosshairs of a battle for control. Their dream of a peaceful life in a picturesque neighborhood was supposed to be their sanctuary. The front porch, framed by white picket fences and shaded by towering oaks, looked like something out of a magazine. It was the kind of place they had always imagined, a place where they could build a life, raise a family, and live with freedom. But their first day in the neighborhood proved to be more unsettling than they had ever anticipated. As they unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, a sleek black car slowed down by their driveway. Inside, a well-dressed man with a stern look on his face rolled down the window. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, but his tone was cold and businesslike. "I'm Dave, the HOA representative. Just wanted to make sure you were aware of the community's rules." He handed Jake a thick packet of paperwork, the glossy pages filled with jargon and regulations that seemed harmless at first glance. "The HOA has specific guidelines for landscaping, parking, exterior decor, and even the way you maintain your lawn. We take pride in this community. Violations of any of the rules could result in fines." He said it all with such authority that Jake couldn't help but feel a chill. They laughed it off, thinking it was just standard procedure. After all, the neighborhood looked beautiful, pristine even. They were eager to fit in, to comply with whatever simple rules it took to be part of this community. How difficult could it be? The first few weeks passed without issue. The lawn was mowed to perfection, the mailbox was pristine, and they kept their car parked in the driveway rather than on the street. But then, one morning, Sarah received a letter. It was from the HOA. The letter was official, printed in bold letters. "Violation of HOA rules. Immediate action required." Sarah's heart dropped as she opened it. The infraction: her garden gnome, an innocent little ornament she had inherited from her grandmother, was deemed an unsightly and out-of-place piece of decor. The HOA required her to remove it within 48 hours, or she'd face a fine. Sarah couldn't believe it. Her beloved garden gnome, an heirloom she cherished, was suddenly the cause of a dispute. She called Jake at work, frustration seeping into her voice as she explained the absurdity of it. "They can't be serious," she muttered. But Jake, ever the optimist, suggested they simply comply. After all, they wanted to avoid making waves in their new home. But something about this didn't sit right with Sarah. She felt a gnawing unease in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It felt like the first step in a more sinister pattern. The HOA was watching them, every move, every detail, and they were ready to pounce, no matter how trivial the issue seemed. The tension started to build. Sarah tried to tell herself it wasn't a big deal. But the gnome was just the beginning. Soon, the HOA began to send more letters, warnings for tiny infractions like the exact shade of their front door not matching the neighborhood's approved color palette, or the angle of their patio furniture being deemed too distracting. Each notice felt like a violation of something deeper, their right to live as they saw fit. It was clear now. The HOA wasn't about rules, it was about control. The quiet suburban dream was starting to feel more like a prison, and Sarah and Jake were trapped inside. And as the notices continued to arrive, each more absurd than the last, the feeling of being under surveillance, of being at the mercy of faceless bureaucrats, gnawed at their peace. They weren't just paying for a home, they were paying for a life they didn't control. As Sarah stared out the window that evening, watching the sun set behind the towering trees, she felt something shift in her. They had been warned, but this was just the beginning. There had to be more to this story than just following rules. Somewhere beneath the surface of these petty disputes, there was a much larger battle brewing, a battle for control. And she wasn't going to lose. The letter from the HOA sat on the kitchen counter like a ticking time bomb. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off it as she brewed her morning coffee, the bold print mocking her every time she glanced at it. Violation of HOA rules. Immediate action required. This time, it wasn't about a gnome. It was worse. Her stomach twisted into knots as she read through the fine print. A fine has been issued for your car being parked in the driveway overnight, in violation of Section 14B of the Community Regulations. Her mind raced. This couldn't be real. It's just a car. It's not like we have guests over every night. Why does it even matter? But the letter didn't care about her frustration. It was cold, detached, and signed with the same threatening line. Failure to comply may result in further penalties, including suspension of community privileges and additional fines. She slammed the letter down on the counter. This wasn't just petty anymore. This was a campaign, one that felt deliberately designed to wear them down, to force them to bend under the weight of their demands. What had started with trivial complaints was now escalating quickly. Sarah knew she had to confront it head-on, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far worse. Later that afternoon, Jake came home from work, tired and distracted. But the moment he saw Sarah's face, his shoulders tensed. "What's wrong?" "The car," Sarah said, her voice thick with frustration. "The HOA sent another letter. They're fining us for parking in the driveway. Again." She could feel her pulse quicken. The absurdity of it all made her want to scream. "Jake, this is insane. They've crossed a line. It's like they're out to get us." Jake let out a long breath. "We just need to pay the fine and move on. It's not worth fighting over something so small." But Sarah shook her head. "No, Jake, it's not about the car. It's about everything else. It's like they're picking at us. Tiny things, one after another. We can't just keep letting them do this." Jake didn't reply. His silence told her everything she needed to know. He just wanted to get along, keep the peace. But Sarah's heart was beating faster now. This wasn't just about rules. This was about power, and the HOA had it in spades. They could invade every corner of their lives, making them feel small, insignificant, and utterly powerless. She couldn't just sit back and accept it. She knew they had to push back. But how? They had no leverage. They had no allies in this fight. They were two small fish swimming in a sea of rules and regulations, completely at the mercy of an all-powerful HOA. That night, Sarah barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought that they had no control over their own home. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the next letter arriving, the next fine, the next rule that would force them to bend to the HOA's will. But then, in the midst of the darkness, an idea began to form. It was small at first, just a spark of a thought, something she brushed aside. But the more she thought about it, the more it began to take shape, like a puzzle piece fitting into place. What if, just what if, there was a way to turn the tables on them? What if they could find a way to beat the HOA at their own game? Not by fighting with words or filing complaints, but by playing a much deeper game. The tension in Sarah's chest began to loosen, replaced with a surge of excitement. A plan was forming, and it was brilliant, but it would take patience, strategy, and most importantly, secrecy. They had to be careful. The next morning, she made a quiet phone call, researching the history of the land around their community, digging into property records. Something told her that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The game had changed, and Sarah was about to take control. Sarah spent the next few days in a haze, her mind swirling with the looming threat of the HOA's control. She could feel the pressure building as the letters piled up on the counter like a stack of bricks, each one a symbol of her helplessness. But deep down, a quiet voice urged her to fight back. This couldn't be their fate. One evening, as the sky outside deepened into twilight, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, scanning through property records and community plans she'd found online. She knew she was taking a risk. The HOA was notorious for scrutinizing residents, and if they found out she was researching, they'd consider it a threat. But she had to know more. With every click, Sarah combed through documents, searching for a loophole, a weak point, anything she could use. Most of it was mind-numbing stuff about community meetings, landscaping guidelines, and rules about exterior lighting. But then, something caught her eye. A map of the neighborhood's property lines. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a layout of streets and parcels. But there was something off about it. The plot of land beneath the community's entrance gate. It wasn't owned by the HOA. Sarah leaned in closer, squinting at the document. Her heart started to beat faster. The gate that controlled the entire neighborhood, the one that dictated who could enter and who could leave, wasn't actually under HOA ownership. The plot was privately held, listed under a small, obscure name that didn't even sound like a company. Her breath caught in her throat. Could this be it? She clicked on the name of the owner and pulled up the property records. The land had been bought years ago by someone who lived outside the community, and there it was, no sign of the HOA ever having any claim to it. The gate, the very thing that gave the HOA its power over the residents, wasn't their property at all. It was a separate piece of land that the HOA had always assumed was under their control. Sarah couldn't believe it. This wasn't just some harmless piece of land. It was the linchpin of the HOA's authority. The gate's owner had the power to lock it, to open it, to shut down access to the neighborhood entirely. And the HOA had been blind to it for years. The tension in Sarah's body exploded into excitement. This was the key. This was how she could fight back. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. If she could somehow buy this land, she would hold the most critical piece of leverage over the HOA. They couldn't regulate anything if they couldn't control the gate. And with this, Sarah could not only take control of their entrance, but also show the HOA exactly who was in charge. But her heart sank as the reality of it all settled in. The owner of the land was an anonymous investor, and there was no way of knowing how much they would ask for it, or if someone else would snatch it up before she could make a move. It would take a lot of money, and a lot of guts. She'd need to act fast. But what choice did she have? As Sarah closed the laptop, her mind raced with plans, calculations, and contingencies. There was no turning back now. She had found her way in, and it was a game changer. She wasn't just a helpless homeowner anymore. She was about to take control of the very thing that had been used to control her. And the HOA would never see it coming. The weeks following Sarah's discovery were a blur. Every moment seemed consumed by one thought. How can I get control of that land? The gate was the key, and she now held the knowledge of its ownership in her hands. But with that knowledge came a heavy burden. She knew this move would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire neighborhood. If she could get her hands on that land, she would become the most powerful person in the community, the one who could stop the HOA in its tracks. But how could she pull it off? The first step was to gather the money. She and Jake had some savings, but it wasn't nearly enough to buy the plot outright. To make matters worse, the HOA was starting to escalate their tactics. Fines were coming faster than ever, and Sarah could feel the tightening grip of their control. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Even the neighbors seemed nervous, as though they too were waiting for the next shoe to drop. But no one had the guts to stand up to the HOA, except for her. She couldn't waste time. But every time she thought about going forward, doubt crept in. What if the seller of the land wanted too much? What if the HOA somehow caught wind of what she was planning and blocked her at the last minute? She had already seen how far they were willing to go to keep control. They would stop at nothing to maintain their power. One evening, after Jake had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table, the dim glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The quiet was suffocating, the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. This wasn't just about a small act of rebellion. This was a fight for her family's future in this home. The thought of being free of the HOA's reach, their surveillance, their endless fines, their petty rules, was intoxicating. But what if it all backfired? Her mind churned with possibilities. If she bought the land, would she truly be able to get the HOA offer back? Or would they retaliate in ways she couldn't predict, financially, legally, or worse? They were relentless, and no one had dared to challenge their authority in years. The phone call she had made to the land's owner a few days earlier had been brief, and the price they quoted was steep, far steeper than she'd anticipated. But as Sarah replayed the conversation in her mind, something gnawed at her. The land was valuable, yes, but the owner didn't seem eager to part with it. The longer she waited, the more likely someone else might step in. She needed to act now, while the opportunity was still there. Her fingers hovered over her phone. Should I take out a loan? Should I sell some of our investments? She had never felt so torn. The risk was enormous, but the potential payoff was even greater. If I do this, I can take back control. The thought was seductive, and her resolve started to harden. She picked up the phone and dialed the number to her bank. As the phone rang, her pulse quickened. She was about to make a move that could alter the course of her life forever. There would be no going back from this. But she was done being a pawn in the HOA's game. If she had to play dirty to win, so be it. The phone clicked in her ear. "Hello, this is Ryan from Homeowners. How may I help you tonight?" Sarah cleared her throat. "I need to know if I can take out a loan to purchase a piece of land. And I need to know how quickly it can be processed." The decision had been made. Now it was just a matter of securing the funds and executing her plan. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she listened to the banker's words, but she barely heard them. All she could think about was one thing. The HOA wouldn't know what hit them. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah's mind was constantly occupied with the plan. Each new development, each new detail, all spiraling toward one inevitable conclusion. She had to secure the land before anyone else could. Every time the HOA sent another fine or regulation, the weight of her decision felt heavier. But she refused to let doubt creep in. This was her chance. The power was finally within reach. Jake remained oblivious to the deeper workings of Sarah's plan. She had told him she was dealing with the HOA, that she was trying to figure things out, but he hadn't pushed her for details. The tension between them had grown over the last few weeks. Jake, still reluctant to confront the HOA, just wanted peace. But Sarah couldn't be content with peace anymore, not when her freedom was on the line. On Thursday evening, Sarah received the call she had been waiting for. The loan had been approved. The money was hers, if she was willing to take the risk. The terms were straightforward, but the stakes were immense. The bank had agreed to fund the purchase of the land, but with a steep interest rate. They'd even extended a line of credit to ensure she could manage any unforeseen costs. Sarah's hand shook as she hung up the phone. She stared at the screen of her laptop, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. It felt like a moment frozen in time, a point of no return. If she signed the papers, there would be no turning back. She would be financially tied to the land and the HOA, at least for the time being. But if she didn't, the window of opportunity would close, and she would lose control of her own future. There was a knock at the door. Startled, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She quickly glanced at the clock. Almost midnight. She made her way to the front door, her mind racing. Who could it be? Her hand shook as she opened the door, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in front of her was Dave, the same HOA representative who had first greeted them when they moved in. His expression was unreadable, his posture stiff. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood two other men, dressed in dark suits, their faces as cold as the night air. "Sarah," Dave said, his voice sharp and controlled, "we need to talk." For a moment, Sarah stood frozen. The sudden appearance of the HOA felt ominous, like a predator cornering its prey. She had barely opened her mouth to respond when one of the men behind Dave stepped forward, holding a thick envelope in his hands. "This is a formal notice of a pending legal action," the man said, his voice flat. "You're in violation of community codes, and we are now considering further steps to resolve this issue. We strongly advise that you cease all activities related to the land you're attempting to acquire." Sarah's stomach lurched. They knew. They knew everything. Her pulse raced as her mind scrambled for a way to respond. How had they found out? Was it a coincidence that they were here, on her doorstep, the night she was about to make the final decision? Had they been watching her all along? Dave's gaze hardened as he noticed her hesitation. "We can make this easy for you, Sarah. If you simply agree to follow our guidelines and comply with our requests, we can avoid any legal repercussions. It's in your best interest." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. The HOA had been watching her every move. They were trying to intimidate her into backing down, trying to shut her down before she could make her play. She stood tall, her voice steady despite the rising storm of panic inside her. "I'm not backing down. You can't control me." Dave's eyes narrowed, and he stepped back, signaling the two men behind him. "This isn't over, but don't make this more difficult than it has to be." As they turned to leave, Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. She closed the door, her hands trembling. She was no longer in the dark. The HOA knew she was planning something, and they were ready to fight back with everything they had. But now, she knew exactly what she had to do. There was no more time for hesitation. She had the power to take them down, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. The encounter with Dave and the two men left Sarah shaken, but it also ignited something inside her, a fire she hadn't known was there. She had been pushed into a corner, and now there was no turning back. The HOA had made their move, warning her off with the heavy weight of legal threats, but rather than intimidate her, it only solidified her resolve. If they thought she'd back down, they were sorely mistaken. With the evening's events still fresh in her mind, Sarah paced the living room, her thoughts whirling in a frantic dance. She knew she was in dangerous territory now, crossing a line that might cost her more than just money. But the truth was, the HOA had already made it clear that they wouldn't stop until they had everything under their control. They saw her as an obstacle to their power, and she couldn't let them win. Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a text from Jake. "Hey, how'd the meeting go?" "You good?" Her fingers hovered over the screen. How could she even begin to explain what had just happened? She didn't want to drag him into this any deeper than she already had, but she needed him on her side more than ever. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore. She was fighting for their future, for their right to live without fear of some faceless entity dictating their lives. She typed quickly, "We need to talk. It's about the HOA. I think they know what I'm planning." Almost immediately, his reply came. "What do you mean? You haven't done anything yet, have you?" Her stomach twisted. Not yet, but soon, and there was no time to waste. She sent another message. "I have a plan. It's risky, but I can take them down. I'm buying the land under the gate." The reply came faster this time. "Sarah, no, it's too dangerous. You don't know what they're capable of." Her heart sank as she read his words. She had known he'd be hesitant, but she hadn't expected him to be so scared. She needed him to understand. She needed him to be on her side. "Jake, it's the only way. They're not going to stop. I'm doing this whether you're with me or not. I just wanted you to know." She sent it before she could overthink. Her finger hovered over the screen for a long moment, but there was nothing more to say. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about her freedom. And if Jake couldn't see that, she'd have to make this fight on her own. Minutes passed, stretching out like hours. She stared at her phone, waiting for a response, but nothing came. A cold knot formed in her stomach as the silence grew louder. What was he thinking? Was he going to leave her to handle this alone? Suddenly, the phone buzzed again. "Okay, I trust you. Let's do this." Relief washed over her like a wave, but she didn't have time to bask in it. The battle was only beginning, and she knew the HOA wasn't going to let this go without a fight. At dawn, Sarah met with the seller of the land, a man named Frank who had remained enigmatic on the phone. His property was the key to everything. But as she shook his hand and sat down across from him at the small, cluttered table in his office, she felt an undercurrent of unease. Frank didn't smile, didn't offer small talk. He just stared at her with a cold, calculating look, as if he were appraising her every move. "I've seen the offers," Frank said, his voice low and gruff. "And I know why you're here, but make no mistake, you're not the only one interested in this land." Sarah's pulse quickened. The words were a warning, but she wasn't about to back down now. "I'll pay what you want," she said, her voice steady. "But it has to be done quickly. The HOA is already aware of me." Frank leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "It'll cost you more than just money, you know. Once you make the purchase, the HOA won't let you walk away unscathed. This game is dangerous." Sarah met his eyes, unwavering. "I'm already in it. I don't have a choice now." Frank's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. "I figured as much. Fine. Let's talk numbers." The deal was set, but Sarah knew it wasn't over. The real fight was just beginning. The weeks following Sarah's meeting with Frank blurred into one long, tense stretch. The land was hers now, officially and legally. But the price had been steep, far more than she'd anticipated. Frank had played his part, but his warnings had lingered in Sarah's mind like a shadow, refusing to fade. The HOA had no idea yet. She hadn't told them. No one in the neighborhood knew either. The gate was still under their control, but Sarah's plan was in motion. She had the deed to the land. She had what she needed to break their grip on the entire neighborhood. But even as she paced the empty house in the quiet of night, something gnawed at her. The HOA had been silent for days. Too silent. It was as though they were waiting for her to make a move. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something was up, that they were watching her every step. The unease gnawed at her, keeping her awake long past midnight. The decision she had made was no longer just a gamble. It was a war, and she had entered it blindly. Was she even prepared for the consequences? She couldn't let herself hesitate now. That night, after Jake went to bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. She had everything she needed to take down the HOA. The land gave her leverage over their gate, but that power came with its own set of risks. Her phone buzzed, and her heart skipped a beat as she saw the message flash across the screen. It was from Jake. "I spoke to a lawyer today. He says if the HOA finds out what you did, they could sue you for interfering with the community's access. You might have just made it worse." The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Sarah stared at the message, the words sinking into her gut like stones. Was this a warning from Jake, or was it a sign that she had miscalculated? Her fingers trembled as she typed back, "I know what I'm doing. I'll handle it. We can't let them control us anymore." She didn't wait for a response. She couldn't. There was no turning back now. The next day, the HOA's silence was finally broken. A letter arrived, hand-delivered by one of their agents, sealed in an envelope as thick as a novel. Sarah ripped it open as soon as the door closed behind her. The letter was short, blunt, and chilling. "We know about the land purchase. Consider this your final warning. If you do not comply with our regulations, we will pursue legal action to revoke your rights to the land and take further steps to protect the community. The gate will remain under our control. Do not test us." Sarah's pulse raced as she read the words over and over. The HOA knew. They knew everything. They were coming for her, and they weren't going to stop until they crushed her. She crumpled the letter in her hands, fury rising in her chest. They won't stop. Not now. Not ever. The words were like a vow, but the weight of her plan was crushing her. What if it didn't work? What if the HOA had a bigger ace up their sleeve than she could ever anticipate? In that moment, she realized the truth. This was a fight to the end. If she backed down now, everything she had worked for would be lost. If she didn't follow through, the HOA would win. They'd always win. But if she kept going, if she pushed past the fear, there was a chance she could bring them down. There was no time to waste. Sarah picked up the phone and dialed Frank's number. "It's time," she said when he answered, her voice steady but determined. "I figured it would be," Frank replied, his tone unreadable. "You're in deeper now than ever. Don't say I didn't warn you." "I don't care about warnings anymore," Sarah said, her voice hard. "Let's finish this." Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts as she stared at the phone, the last words she had spoken to Frank still echoing in her mind. "Let's finish this." The finality of it struck her, each word an irreversible commitment to the battle that was now unavoidable. The HOA was coming for her, and they weren't going to back down. But neither was she. She grabbed the papers on the table, the land deed now weighing heavily in her hands. She was no longer just Sarah, a homeowner caught in a dispute over a petty gate. She was a warrior in a war she hadn't chosen, but one she had no choice but to fight. Frank's warning still rang in her ears. The HOA was ruthless, unyielding, and yet something about his voice had stayed with her. It hadn't been fear that she'd heard, but something darker, something that made Sarah wonder just how much he had been involved in the HOA's manipulation. Was he a pawn, or had he been part of the game all along? There were so many unknowns, so much danger, but it didn't matter now. If she backed down, the HOA would suffocate her, squeeze every ounce of freedom, until she couldn't breathe. She couldn't let that happen. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table again, the glowing screen of her phone illuminating her face. She hit send on the text to Jake before she could second-guess herself. "It's time. I need you to meet me at the gate tomorrow night." The hours dragged by in a slow, relentless crawl. She could feel the pressure mounting, her anxiety building to a near-fever pitch. The unknowns kept swirling in her mind. Would Jake stand by her side? Would the HOA retaliate even harder now that they knew she was ready for a fight? As the sun set the next day, Sarah drove to the plot of land she had purchased, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The gate was silent and still, standing like a barrier between her and everything she had fought for. But tonight, it would become something else. It would become the symbol of her victory or her defeat. She arrived early, too early, pacing around the property like a caged animal, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. Every rustle of wind, every creak of wood, made her jump. Her mind ran wild with the possibilities. What if Jake couldn't make it? What if the HOA had one last trick up their sleeve? Was she really prepared to follow through with this? Was she prepared to lose everything? A car pulled up, breaking through her spiraling thoughts. Jake. He stepped out of the car, his face tense but determined. As he walked toward her, the tension in her chest eased slightly. She needed him more than ever now. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their plan hanging between them. "I'm with you," Jake said quietly, breaking the silence. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything Sarah had been longing to hear. This was no longer just her fight. It was theirs. Without another word, they turned toward the gate. Sarah held up the deed to the land in her hand, her grip tight. They didn't know it yet, but the HOA had already lost. As the moon rose high above them, casting long shadows over the property, Sarah and Jake reached the gate. There, hidden in the shadows, was the key to their future. With a single motion, Sarah pulled the lever she had secretly installed the night before. The gate groaned in protest, but it opened, revealing the path beyond it. A sudden burst of light blinded her as headlights flashed in the distance. A car screeched to a halt at the entrance. The HOA. They had arrived, but it was too late. With the gate open and the deed to the land in her hands, Sarah had done what no one thought was possible. She had won. The HOA's control was broken. The gate was now hers. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something she hadn't in a long time. Freedom. And in that freedom, there was the realization that she had not just fought for her home. She had fought for everyone in the neighborhood who had been silenced by fear. She had taken control of her future. As the figures from the HOA stepped out of the car, Sarah turned to face them. She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She stood tall, victorious. The gate was hers. The battle had been won.